to Iraq in 2004 for the first time. It didn't start when I was 4 or 5 playing with G.I. Joe dolls. I kind of stumbled into war, like a lot of war reporters. It wasn't something necessarily that I dreamed of doing, covering conflict. I wish I could take back some of the things that I've seen covering war. I went to Iraq because in 2003, when the US invaded, I was a business reporter at the Washington Post. My job was to cover the billions of dollars of reconstruction spending that Congress had approved to rebuild Iraq. I wasn't one of the reporters who, when the US invaded, raised my hand and said, I gotta go because I've always wanted to cover war, I've always wanted to cover conflict. I wanted to go to Iraq because that's where my story was gonna take me. And I couldn't convince my editors at the time to let me go. So I ultimately went to Iraq because the story that I was on was Abu Ghraib. Now I tell my students, I talk to my students about the Abu Ghraib prison scandal. Most of them have never heard of it. I was covering the business of war, and I got a phone call one day. And I got a phone call from a friend who said, do you remember when you moved into your apartment? There was a young woman who helped you move. I said, no, I'm sorry, I don't remember, but thank her. She said, well, she's in Iraq, and she's in trouble, and she wants to talk to you. And so I said, well, have her give me a call. So I went to my editor, and I said, I know this has nothing to do with the business of war, but I think there's a story here. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I think there's a story. And he said, Halliburton, we're interested in Halliburton at the time. We're interested, you stay on your story. And so I did what any good reporter would do. I ignored him. I continued to talk to Sabrina Harmon. And I was down in Texas about a month later, covering Halliburton and the story, the business of war. And I got a call from my editor, and he said, remember that story you told me about a month ago? Well, 60 Minutes is airing a story tonight with some photographs from Abu Ghraib prison. I think that's what you were trying to tell me about. He said, yes. So we've got to get it in the paper tomorrow. 60 Minutes is going to scoop us. I said, I can't do that. And I couldn't do that because I had been off the record with Sabrina Harmon talking to me from Iraq up until that point. Now, as I tell my students, what would have been the harm, right? Sabrina Harmon, she was a grunt, she was a low level, I think she was a specialist at the time. Would anybody have known that I had broken the deal with her to be off the record? I would have known. And so I had to wait an entire day, I think it was almost 2 days, in order to get Sabrina Harmon on the record, to get her story of what it was like to be a troop in Iraq accused of abusing detainees. And so after I helped the Washington Post break that story of the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, my editors came to me and they said, thank you, what do you want? I said, the same thing I've wanted for the past year. I want to go to Iraq. And I was convinced at the time that the reason I still wanted to go was to cover the business of war, to follow that story to Iraq. And so they said, we'll send you for a couple of weeks. You can cover, I had a little bit of experience covering the military court system. We'll send you for a couple of weeks. And you can cover the trials, because all the soldiers who had been accused of abusing detainees at Abu Ghraib were then going to be put on trial. So I made a few arrangements. I think I left food in my refrigerator. I was only going to be gone a couple of weeks. I had no training really about going into a hostile environment. And I went for about 2 years. And what I learned in those 2 years is that I was pretty good at covering war. There's a photo of me from the Battle of Fallujah. I've got all my equipment there. In the fall of 2004, the Washington Post, I hadn't done a lot of embedding. I hadn't done a lot of, spending time with the troops. And the Battle of Fallujah, the United States was getting ready, the military with the Iraqi army was getting ready to take the city back from Al-Qaeda and the insurgents. And so the Washington Post sent me to cover the Battle of Fallujah. I didn't want to go. It was a great assignment to cover the Battle of Fallujah. Some of the best reporters of my generation who would cover conflict were going to be there to cover war, and I didn't want to be there because I was scared. And I remember a few nights before the battle, I was sitting and I was talking with Ann Garrels of NPR. She was sort of my hero, my model of a war reporter and a journalist. And Ann had so much experience covering conflict. She'd been covering conflict for decades. She's a very, very seasoned correspondent. And she gave me on a piece of paper the name and number of her husband in case she died. And I realized at that moment that Ann Garrels was scared. She was scared about what was going to happen. You have to imagine, the Battle of Fallujah was urban, hand-on-hand combat. It was a really, really dangerous battle. The entire city was booby-trapped. The United States military had said to the people of Fallujah before they went in, get out, because if you're here, we're going to assume you're a bad guy. We're going to assume you're an insurgent. And so the city had mostly vacated. Not everybody left. Not everybody leaves when there's a storm coming in Florida, right? So not everybody could get out. Not everybody could leave. And as we were getting ready, the press corps was getting ready to go to with our various units. Sitting there, and I had this conversation with Ann Garrels, and I realized that she was scared. And it was a very important lesson for me as a war correspondent. I realized that I was going to survive if I stayed a little bit scared. Because there are two things in covering war. There's calculated risk, and then there's stupid risk. And as long as I made sure that my risks were calculated, I was probably going to be okay. So I covered the Battle of Fallujah. I think I was embedded for about 6 weeks with both the Army and the Marines. And about a month ago, Brian Williams, I probably don't have to say much more than that. You know, the controversy around Brian Williams, whether or not he was in a helicopter that got shot at in Iraq. And I was hearing from a lot of people who wanted to hear my perspective as a war correspondent. Was I personally offended that Brian Williams may or may not have lied? Wasn't personally offended. We all have stories. We go to war. Sometimes things happen, sometimes things don't. My issues were with the larger issues about journalism, what it meant, and I think the bigger problem was that Brian Williams was his own boss at NBC. Nobody was in charge of him. But as I was thinking about my own experience covering Fallujah, and I've written a book about my time in Iraq, and I've spoken all over the country for probably close to 7 years now about Iraq. And I always talk about the Battle of Fallujah because it really was a defining moment for me, much more so than almost being kidnapped outside of Abu Ghraib prison, which happened on June 14, 2004. It's a date you don't forget when Al-Qaeda grabs you. But I talk about the Battle of Fallujah because it was a significant battle, both for the journalists who covered it, for the people for whom the battle came to, and also for the soldiers and Marines and seamen and airmen who were there. And whenever I talk about Fallujah, I talk about how most nights I went to bed and I wasn't quite sure if I was going to wake up the next morning. It was scary. It was really, really scary to cover the Battle of Fallujah. And as I recounted the story and talked about wearing my helmet over my face so that if we got mortared in the middle of the night or something happened, my mom would be able to identify my body, I think about, was I really scared every night? Or was it most nights? Or was it just some nights? And this whole incident with Brian Williams made me think about how I report out my own story when I talk about Iraq. And so now I'm going to tell you for the first time, because this is the first time I've talked about Iraq since the Brian Williams thing. I don't know if I was scared every night. I was scared a lot of nights. I was scared some nights, because Fallujah was pretty scary. People died. Soldiers died. Civilians died. Journalists were hurt in the Battle of Fallujah. I covered the front line of the battle, but I also covered the rear. My colleague at the New York Times, Dexter Filkins, was on the front line of the war. He had a completely different experience than I did. I was not with a frontline unit. I was too scared to be. I stayed mostly in the back, covering the troops there. So one thing that Iraq and Afghanistan taught me is that there's really no front line in battle anymore. The minute you step off a plane and you put your foot on soil in Iraq or Afghanistan, you're in battle, you're on the front line. And so, we as consumers of news and Hollywood, we like the story of the snipers, and the infantrymen. But anybody who went to Iraq or Afghanistan was on the front line of battle. And I came across this guy, this young Marine who you see here, after the Battle of Fallujah. And I had spent, I think it was about 6 weeks. And I was supposed to go back to Baghdad to join my team in Baghdad, and I couldn't go home yet, couldn't go back to Baghdad. I decided that the best thing I could do was hitch a ride with this guy who was driving a fuel tanker down the highway of death to the triangle of death in Iraq. I thought that would be a good idea. So I hitched a ride with him, and I wrote this story about him. He was this young kid, and the way that he calmed himself is he sang. He sang Michael Jackson. He sang all these songs as he was driving down. And I wrote this story. You know, it wasn't a big story. It ran in the middle of the A section. It wasn't on the front page. It was just about this one kid who was driving a fuel tanker down the highway of death in one of the most dangerous roads in Iraq, and what it was like to be him. And I like to tell those kinds of stories when I was in Iraq. And I remember when I got down to the Marine base where I was headed, and the story published, and one of his commanders came to me and said, you know, he got in trouble for that. I said, what? I was trying to make him famous. But this is something that war reporting taught me. And believe me, I'm going to get to objectivity in a moment, but there's a lot of lead up before I can get to objectivity. I was on that embed with the Marines, and we were in the town of Latakia, and we were looking for 2 French journalists who had been kidnapped. I say we, right? It's just along for the ride. The Marines were looking for these 2 French journalists who had been kidnapped. And we came across this woman who was selling shoes. And to me, everything about what I love about journalism, what I love about storytelling, was in that frame. Who was this woman? Who wears these shoes in Iraq? And where do they come from? And how much do people pay for them? And why is she not at home? And where's her family? And where's her husband? Because this was a very conservative part of Iraq. So why was she working? Why did she need to work? What was the security situation that allowed her to sit there selling these shoes? Had she seen the kidnappers who went after the French journalists? Had she seen the French journalists? Where did the shoes come from? Most of them were made in China. But which border did they come across? Did they come across the border with Jordan? Did they come from Syria? Did they fly in? Did they drop off a truck? Where did they come from? And in that moment, I realized why I love journalism. Because somebody was paying me to ask those questions. And where this woman got those shoes, and how she was selling them, and who she was selling them to, told you a lot about the story of Iraq at the time. I'm just showing you pictures. So one of the most dangerous things that a journalist could do in Iraq, there were the car bombs, right? Wrong place, wrong time. Didn't really worry too much about those. But one of the most dangerous things for me as a journalist was being embedded with the U.S. military. Because as a journalist, when I go to war, see, I'm getting to objectivity. When I went to war, I left my passport at home, metaphorically. I had to have a passport to get on the plane. I did not go as an American journalist, I went as a journalist. I went as somebody who wanted to bear witness. I didn't go because I represented the United States government. I didn't go because I wanted to see somebody win. I went to battle because there was one. That's why journalists go to war. I have probably since 2006, when I was home on book tour, I probably have talked about Iraq hundreds of times. I've never once shared with anyone publicly whether I thought the Iraq war was a good or a bad thing. I said that one time giving a speech at Berkeley, and I got booed by nearly 2,000 people. It was the highlight of my career. People were so desperate to hear me say what they wanted to hear. And I learned a valuable lesson about objectivity in war at that moment. It didn't really matter what I reported. People were going to find their truth in whatever I reported. And so I couldn't worry too much about it. I just kind of had to write. I had to take pictures. I had to document the war as I was seeing it and let people make up their own minds. But it became very important as I talked about Iraq more that I didn't share my opinion. Because the moment that I do, people will go back to my body of work, which I'm really proud of, and they will look for clues to how I came to my opinion. They will analyze my stories and say, see, that's why she wrote that story. She was for or against the war in Iraq. One of the things that is really hard for those of us to cover war is to hear from people who don't really understand why we're there. I have showed this picture all over the country. This is my colleague. I'm going to ask you to kind of in your head tell me whether you know who this is. You probably don't. This is Joao Silva. Probably out of 1,000 people I've shown this photo to all over the country, maybe 3 people have recognized his face. He stepped on a landmine in Afghanistan. It blew off both his legs. Joao gave me permission to show you these photos. He was on this embed, and this is the photo he took the moment before he stepped on the landmine, and then he took 3 photos, because this is what we do as journalists covering war. 1, 2, 3, and he went down. But that was his instinct. He knew something bad had happened. He stepped on the landmine, and he kept taking pictures. So very few people have recognized him. Very few people have recognized this guy either. This is my friend Chris Hondros. Chris and I had dinner in Cairo in 2010, or the spring of 2011. We were both covering Arab Spring. And I remember we had this great, we were about the same age, and we were having this conversation about what do you do next. And Chris was getting married that summer. And he said, what do you want to spend? I said, I want to have a kid. And we were sort of having those great discussions about life after war. And Chris was killed a week later in Libya. He took a mortar round to the head. And so I show people these photos, and I particularly show my students who are interested in war reporting these photos, because I want to remind them that you can be really good, and Jawad and Chris are some of the best combat photographers of my generation, and you can be really, really famous, and you can be really, really dead. So you have to ask yourself, why am I here? Why am I reporting these stories? This is Camp Bucca, the maternity ward for ISIS, right? How many of us, and I include myself in this, were paying attention to the story in 2004 and 2005 to understand that the detainees at this camp were getting together and formulating radical ideology that is shaping the news stories that we're watching today, right? The leader of ISIS right now came from Camp Bucca. He was in detention. So when I go through all my photos and I look through this and I think about, war and why I'm there and the distance and all of that, and I come across this photo and I look at myself and I think, what is wrong with you? You look so happy. You're in the bag. I remember it's Valentine's Day in 2005, and I'm wearing this flak jacket, and I have press in duct tape across it, and I've written it on my neck and my arm and my leg, because if I lost a body part, I wanted people to know immediately what my blood type was and what my last name was. And I've done all this, and this is a ritual, and I'm there, and I'm like, well, you look so happy. What's wrong with you? And I realize it's because the sense of importance in telling that story. It was so important at that time to tell that story. And I tell my students this now. Why do you do journalism? Because you may be the only one in a room when a legislature passes a bill that could discriminate against somebody. You may be the only one paying attention. You may be the only one paying attention when a city leader decides to do something that affects all of us. And you may be the only one in the room when somebody's holding a gun to a man's head. That's the kind of journalism that we do as war reporters, and that's why we go to war, to be there. So thank you very much.